They declared war on Earth. No one told them what we really are. The transmission came in while I was drinking my second coffee of the morning. Not during a battle. Not during some critical system failure that had everyone screaming across the bridge. During coffee, I had the mug halfway to my lips when Lieutenant Kara Flynn turned from her console and said, very quietly, "Commander Osei, you need to hear this. My name is Yara Osei. I am a weapons systems officer aboard the UES Persistence, and I have served in enough tight spots across enough years to know that when someone says you need to hear this in that particular tone, low, careful, like they're handing you broken glass, you put the mug down." I put the mug down. The message played through the bridge speakers. It came in on every frequency simultaneously, which was the first thing that bothered me. Not one channel. All of them. Like whoever sent it wanted to make sure there was no possible way to miss it. The language was not human, but the translation software processed it in under 4 seconds, which meant it had been designed to be translated, which meant whoever sent it had done their research. The voice, if you could call it that, sounded like 2 tones played at the same time. One low and steady, one high and thin. Together they formed something that sat right at the edge of what the human ear could tolerate without discomfort. I had a feeling that was deliberate too. The message said, "To the biological organisms inhabiting the third orbital body of star system Sol, you have been assessed. You have been found to occupy a biosphere of extractable value. You will surrender full planetary access within 30 of your solar rotations. Failure to comply will result in termination of your species and repurposing of your world's resources. This communication will not be repeated. The Vathi do not repeat themselves." Then it ended. The bridge was silent for about 4 seconds. Kara Flynn was looking at me. Navigator Dennis Holt was looking at me. Every person on that bridge was looking at me the way people look at someone they are hoping will tell them this is not as bad as it sounds. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. "Run the signal trace," I said. "I want origin coordinates, fleet composition if the sensors can reach that far, and someone get me Captain Barlow." Kara moved. Dennis moved. Everyone moved. That is the thing about a clear order in a bad moment. It gives people somewhere to put their hands. Captain Barlow arrived on the bridge in under 3 minutes. He had the look of a man who had been awake for a long time already, which meant someone had gotten to him before me. He listened to the playback once, standing very still, his hands clasped behind his back. 30 days, he said. 29 now, I said. Approximately. He looked at me. He was not the kind of man who appreciated that kind of comment in a moment like this. He was also not the kind of man who would ever admit that, on some level, he found it steadying. "Get me Earth Command," he said. Earth Command had already gotten him. The channel opened before the words were fully out of his mouth, and we spent the next hour in a briefing that felt less like a military strategy session, and more like the universe playing a very large, very unfunny joke on everyone in the room. The Vathi, we learned, were not new. Other species knew them, feared them the way you fear something that has never once, in its entire recorded history, failed to do what it said it would do. The Galactic Council, a coalition of 7 surviving species who had learned, over centuries, that the best way to keep existing in a universe that contained the Vathi was to stay very quiet and very agreeable, contacted Earth within 6 hours of the original transmission. Their lead diplomat was a species called the Thesari. The one assigned to us was named Vel, and Vel communicated through a combination of translated text and what I can only describe as emotional pressure, a sensation that settled on you like a hand on your shoulder, except the hand knew what you were feeling before you did. Vel was scared, not performed scared, not diplomatically cautious scared. Scared the way a person is scared when they are watching someone walk towards something with no understanding of what it is. The briefing packet the Galactic Council sent was thorough. 17 civilizations. That was the Vathi's count. 17 species that had received the same transmission we just received, and every single one of them was gone. Not defeated, not subjugated, gone. Their planets were still there, catalogued and archived, and the Vathi maintained meticulous records of what had been extracted from each one. Efficient, systematic, patient in the way that things are patient when they have never once had a reason to rush. The Council's message to Earth Command was polite and completely clear. Comply. There is no other outcome that results in your survival. We have watched 17 others choose the alternative. You are a young species. You are not prepared for this. We are sorry, but the mathematics of this situation have only one answer, and we urge you to accept it before the 30 days expire. Earth Command sent back a formal acknowledgement, which bought enough time for the people who actually make decisions to get into rooms together and have the conversations that don't get included in formal acknowledgements. I was not in those rooms. I was on the Persistence, in the engagement corridor the Vathi had identified as their approach vector, sitting in my chair, looking at a star field that looked exactly the same as it always had. Vel reached me on a private channel. The emotional pressure came first. That particular weight of someone who needs you to understand something and is not sure you're going to. Then the translated text. Commander Osei, I have now spoken with 17 of your officials. I have read your history. I want to say something to you directly, outside of formal channels. Go ahead, I said. You do not understand what they are. I looked at my mug, empty. I had been reaching for it out of habit for the last 20 minutes, which told me I was more tired than I was acknowledging. That's probably true, I said. They have never encountered resistance that lasted beyond the first engagement, not once, not in 600 years of operation. The mathematics of loss, of cost, of continuation, the other species understood eventually that the cost of fighting exceeded the cost of compliance. That calculation is what the Vathi depend on. They have refined their methods specifically to make that calculation inevitable. I nodded slowly, even though Vel could not see me nod. It was a good briefing, thorough, the kind of briefing that was designed to produce a specific conclusion in the listener. And what does Earth Command say? Vel asked. They're still in rooms, I said. What do you say? You personally. I thought about that for a moment. Not about the answer. I already knew the answer. I was thinking about how to say it to someone who was genuinely frightened and genuinely trying to help, in a way that was honest without being unkind. I said slowly, that you're right. We don't understand what they are. A pause. I also say that they don't understand what we are. The silence that followed was longer than a translation delay. When Vel spoke again, the emotional pressure had changed. It was not fear anymore. It was something I did not have a clean word for. Grief, maybe. The specific grief of watching someone you like make a choice you cannot stop them from making. I hope you are right, Vel said. I very much hope you are right. 3 hours later, Earth Command transmitted its formal response to the Vathi ultimatum. I was not there when they sent it. I heard about it the way most people heard about it, through the crew, through the network, through the look on Captain Barlow's face when he came back onto the bridge. 2 words, human words, translated into Vathi frequency, sent on every channel simultaneously, because if they could do it, so could we. We decline. No explanation, no counter-proposal, no request for clarification or negotiation or terms. We decline. Captain Barlow stood at the center of the bridge and looked out at the star field for a long time. Then he turned around and looked at all of us, one by one, the way a man looks at something he wants to remember clearly. Get some rest, he said, all of you. We have 29 days, and I intend to use every single one of them. I went to my bunk. I lay down. I stared at the ceiling in the dark. Somewhere in the galaxy, the most dangerous species anyone had ever recorded was reading our response, and, for the first time in 600 years, receiving an answer it had never received before. I should have been afraid. I was. Somewhere underneath everything, I was. But there was something else there too. Something older and less polite. I closed my eyes. 29 days. The first week passed, the way the first week of anything genuinely terrible passes, in lists. Everything became a list. Inventory lists, deployment lists, resource allocation lists, personnel rotation lists, contingency lists, for the contingency lists. The Persistence had never felt busier and never felt quieter at the same time, which is a specific kind of awful that I had experienced before and never quite gotten used to. Earth was mobilizing. That word, mobilizing, does not carry the full weight of what it actually means when the entire planet does it simultaneously. It means shipyards running 3 shifts, It means every fuel depot from here to the outer belt operating at capacity. It means engineers who have been working on theoretical propulsion systems for a decade suddenly getting unlimited budget and a deadline. It means people who were, 1 month ago, arguing about trade agreements and resource rights, now sitting in the same room, trying to agree on a unified command structure. The arguing did not stop, to be clear. It just got faster and louder and more productive, because that is what humans do when the clock is running. I spent those first days coordinating with 3 other weapons officers across the fleet: Lieutenant Obi Hartley from the UES Covenant, Commander Sophie Dan from the UES Iron Gate, and a man named Reggie Nwachukwu from a smaller patrol vessel called the Spur, who had more practical combat hours than anyone else in our working group, and a habit of saying exactly what he thought, which made our meetings both efficient and occasionally exhausting. "They're going to come in high and wide," Reggie said, during our 3rd coordination call. He had a screen full of the Vothi's historical engagement patterns, 17 datasets from the Galactic Council's records. Every single engagement, they spread out, create an envelope, and close it. They don't give you room to maneuver. They make the math simple, and then they let the math do the work. "So we don't fight the envelope," Sophie said. She was one of those people who listened to everything, and then said one very clean thing. "We make them manage a shape they haven't seen before." Reggie looked at her. "That's easier to say than to do." "Most good ideas are," she said. Obi Hartley, who had been quiet for most of the call, leaned forward. He was young for his rank, 28 years old, from a city in northern England, and he had the specific quality of someone who gets uncomfortable when meetings get abstract. "Can we talk about numbers? Because the Council's data says a standard Vothi fleet opens with between 200 and 300 vessels. We have 64 currently positioned in the engagement corridor. Even if Earth gets every shipyard running at full output for the next 3 weeks, we are not matching that number." "No," I said, "we're not." "So what are we doing?" It was a fair question. I had been asking it myself, at a level slightly below conscious thought, for the entire week. "We're being unpredictable," I said, "and we're making sure they know it early." Obi did not look entirely reassured by that. I did not entirely blame him. The Galactic Council continued to send messages. Vel in particular stayed in contact with me more than was probably required by their diplomatic function, which I had come to understand meant that Vel was doing something their own protocols did not formally allow, which was actually caring about the outcome. On the 9th day, Vel sent me a file. It was a recording, not a translation, an actual acoustic record from the second civilization the Vothi had ever erased. The species was called, in the closest approximation the Council could render, the Orvith. They had received the Vothi transmission, evaluated it, and attempted to comply. The recording was of their final Council session, the moment they transmitted surrender. I listened to it once. I do not know what they were saying. The translation attached to the file told me they were debating the precise wording of their capitulation, wanting to make sure they expressed the appropriate level of submission to maximize their chance of receiving mercy. The Vothi had received the transmission, processed it, and proceeded with termination anyway. The compliance had been received 11 hours after the 30-day window closed. 11 hours. I closed the file. I understood why Vel had sent it. It was not a threat. It was a fact. The Vothi's mercy, such as it was not something you could reach through proper wording. There was a window, and then there was no window. And everything after the window was simply what happened. What Vel perhaps did not intend, or perhaps did not predict, was what that recording did to me. I sat with it for a while. In my bunk, in the dark, the same ceiling I had been staring at for 9 days. 11 hours. These beings had spent their final days carefully choosing how to surrender, and it had not mattered at all. The Vothi had not read the nuance of their submission. They had simply noted the time and continued with their process. I thought about that for a long time. Then I got up, went back to the bridge, and filed 3 new targeting proposal documents that I had been sitting on because I thought they might be considered aggressive. They were aggressive. That was, it turned out, the point. On the 14th day, the Galactic Council sent an urgent alert. The Vothi had dispatched a scouting force, not the main fleet, a probe. Standard operating procedure, according to the Council's files. 5 to 7 vessels, fast, heavily shielded, designed to map the target's defensive positions, catalog any resistance capabilities, and return with a recommended approach for the primary fleet. In 17 previous engagements, the scouting force had returned without incident. The civilizations they scouted had either already begun compliance protocols or had made the tactical decision not to engage a force they couldn't stop, saving their strength for a negotiation that would never come. Earth Command's response was very simple. Meet the scouts. Don't attack them. Just be there. Be visible. Be completely calm. That task fell, in significant part, to the Persistence. Captain Barlow had the crew briefed within the hour. There was no speech, nothing dramatic, just information and assignments, and the understanding that what we did in the next several hours would be the first real data the Vathi collected about us. They're going to be studying everything, Barlow told us. The formation we hold, the distances we keep, the signals we put out, the way we move. We are, right now, more of an intelligence operation than a combat operation. I need everyone to remember that. I remembered it. I also pulled up my targeting systems out of habit, not to use them, just to have them warm. The Vathi scouts arrived at the edge of sensor range at 0340 hours, ship time. 6 vessels. Small by fleet standards, but each one bristling with sensor equipment that was scanning us in spectrums our instruments could barely detect. They held position at distance, studying. We held position too. 64 human vessels in a loose formation that was not quite any standard defensive arrangement, because we had deliberately made it something their pattern-matching systems would struggle to classify. And we played music. That had been Obi Hartley's idea, and I had thought he was joking until he explained it. We put it on every external broadcast frequency, he'd said. Not tactical communication, not military signals. Music. Because what does that tell them? That we're not scared. That we're doing something they have no category for. That we have the composure to play music while they're pointing sensors at us. I had pushed it up the chain, half expecting it to be dismissed. It was not dismissed. It was approved within 2 hours, with the specific request that the selection be varied and human and representative of nothing in particular, which meant someone at Earth Command had a sense of humor about the situation. So we sat there, 64 ships in a non-standard formation, in front of a Vathi scouting fleet, broadcasting Fela Kuti, and then something by a band from Manchester, and then something that Kara Flynn put into the queue, that she refused to identify, but that had a very strong rhythm, and made Reggie laugh out loud when it came through his comms. The Vathi scouts ran their scans for 4 hours. Then they hailed us. The translation came through standard channels, the same double-tone voice, but this time, there was something underneath it that the software flagged as a query format. A question, not a demand. Biological entities. You display no standard distress indicators. You display no compliance preparation signals. You are transmitting non-functional audio sequences. Explain your behavioral state. Captain Barlow looked at me. I was not sure why he looked at me. I was a weapons officer, not a diplomat. I answered anyway. We're fine, I said. We're just waiting. A pause, long enough that I wondered if the translation had failed. Explain. Waiting. Waiting for whatever comes next, I said. We've been doing it for a while now. We're pretty good at it. Another pause. You have registered the nature of the force you will face. Yes, I said. And you understand the recorded outcome of all previous engagements. We've read the files, I said. The council sent them over. Very thorough. The pause this time was longer. I could hear Kara Flynn not breathing on the other side of the bridge. Your behavioral response to this information is inconsistent with predictive models. I thought about that for a moment. About the Orveth spending their last 11 hours crafting the perfect words of surrender. About 37 mining workers in the asteroid belt who were going to make their own choices without waiting for anyone's authorization. About Reggie Nwachukwu's laugh, which had been genuine and immediate and not performed for anyone. I know, I said. We get that a lot. The scouts held for another hour. Then, without another transmission, they broke formation and began moving back the way they had come. I watched them go on the display, 6 small shapes pulling away from us, carrying their data and their readings and their inconsistent behavioral models back to a fleet that had never once had to rethink its approach. I picked up my coffee. Cold again, I drank it. "What do you think they'll report?" Kara Flynn asked. She was not asking anyone in particular. "Honestly," Obi Hartley said, "I think they're going to say they don't know what we are." Nobody argued with that. In a room I was not in, on a channel I was not monitoring, Vel sent a message to Earth Command that I only read later, in the official debrief transcripts. The message was short. Vel's emotional pressure did not translate into text, but the record noted it had been present throughout the transmission. The message said, "In 600 years, no scouting fleet has ever returned without a surrender confirmation or a resistance assessment categorized as manageable. They are returning with neither. I do not know what this means for what comes next. I am not certain anyone does." What came next was the main Vathi fleet, but that was 2 weeks away. And we had 2 weeks of humans being humans, which meant 2 weeks of arguments and inventions, and disagreements, and a maintenance crew on the Iron Gate who fixed a power coupling with a piece of equipment that had been designed for a completely different system, and was technically not rated for the job, but worked perfectly, and the engineer who did it was very pleased with herself, and only slightly embarrassed when the report went up the chain. 2 weeks of maybe. The Vathi had no model for maybe. That was, I was beginning to understand, our only advantage. It was enough. The Vathi fleet arrived at 0611 hours, ship time, on the 28th day. I was already awake. I had been awake for 2 hours. Not because an alarm told me to be, but because my body had apparently made its own decision about when this particular morning started, and that decision was 2 hours before my scheduled alert. I lay in my bunk for about 4 minutes pretending this was not happening, and then I got up, got dressed, and went to the bridge. Kara Flynn was already there. So was Dennis Holt. So was half the crew, people who had drifted in from their quarters with the same quiet understanding that no one was going to sleep through this. The display showed 312 vessels. I looked at the number for a moment. 312, Dennis said. Not because anyone needed him to say it out loud, but because sometimes a number that size needs to be spoken to, feel real. "Get me the fleet channel," I said. The channel opened, and the voices of every ship in our formation came through. 64 human vessels in their adjusted formation. Every weapon system warm. Every crew doing what crews do in the last minutes, before something enormous begins. Talking, checking and rechecking things that did not need to be rechecked. Making small jokes that weren't really about anything. Being human. Captain Barlow arrived on the bridge and stood exactly where he always stood. He looked at the display for 3 seconds, and then began giving orders in the specific calm voice that senior officers develop when they have made peace with what is happening, and now simply need to be the steadiest thing in the room. The Vathi fleet moved in a formation that the Council's files described as the closing envelope. They had used it in all 17 previous engagements. It was mathematically elegant. It created a sphere of coverage that eliminated standard retreat vectors, reduced the target's maneuvering space incrementally, and applied pressure in a pattern designed to make resistance feel increasingly futile from the inside. It had worked 17 times. It was, I will say this honestly, terrifying to watch on a display. 312 ships moving in precise, coordinated geometry. The kind of movement that says very clearly, we have done this many times and we know exactly how it ends. Our formation shifted. Not into anything the Vathi files would have recognized, because we had spent 2 weeks making sure of that. Reggie Nwachukwu, from his small vessel on the outer edge of our arrangement, had a description for what we were doing that I thought was accurate. "We're making them look at too many things at once," he'd said, in one of our planning calls. "They've got pattern matching systems that are very good at classifying behavior, so we give them behavior that doesn't classify." The first exchange of fire began at 0714 hours. I will not pretend to be able to narrate a battle of that scale clearly, because I could not see it clearly. No one can see an engagement like that clearly from the inside. What you have is your station, your readouts, your immediate communication channels, and the voices of the people around you. The larger shape of what is happening exists only in fragments. What I can tell you is what I saw from where I was sitting. I can tell you that the Vathi's opening strike was precise and heavy, and landed on 2 of our ships with the kind of force that the Council's files said was designed to remove 20% of an opposing force's capability in the first exchange, creating a psychological imbalance that compounds over time. I can tell you that both ships, the UES March and a patrol vessel called the Kenley, took damage that was severe and real and costly, and that I will not minimize. And I can tell you that within 40 seconds, both ships were still firing. The Vathi's models did not account for that. Their pattern-matching systems had an expected response to a strike of that severity. The response was formation disruption, a breakdown of coordinated behavior as individual vessels prioritized self-preservation over collective positioning. What happened instead was that the March and the Kenley maintained their positions and continued contributing to our collective targeting solution. The March's weapons officer, a woman named Claire Adler, told me afterward that she had made the decision independently. Captain Barlow had not ordered it. No one at Fleet Command had ordered it. She had looked at her damage readouts and her position in the formation and made a calculation that was not in any manual, that staying where she was mattered more than the alternative. I understand that calculation completely. The battle ran for 4 hours and 11 minutes. I am not going to tell you we were winning. We were not winning, not by any conventional measure. We lost 11 vessels in that engagement. The Vathi lost 23, which was a number that had, according to the Council's records, no historical precedent. They had never lost 23 vessels. They had never lost more than 4 in any previous engagement, because previous engagements never developed to the point where significant losses were possible. We were not winning. We were also not stopping. That distinction was, I was beginning to understand, everything. Sometime in the 3rd hour, when the engagement had been running long enough that the initial adrenaline had settled into something grimmer and more focused, something happened that I do not know how to categorize except to say that it changed the texture of the day for me permanently. There was a voice on a secondary frequency, a human voice, male, older than mine, calling a call sign that I had not heard in 5 years. My call sign. Not my name. My call sign. The one assigned to me at my previous posting. The one that no one at my current station would have known to use. The one that connected to a time and a place and a set of events that I had spent 5 years building a very solid wall around. I heard it. Twice. And then the frequency cut. I did not stop what I was doing. I want to be clear about that. My hands stayed on my board. My eyes stayed on my targeting solutions. There was a targeting calculation running that required my complete attention, and it received my complete attention. But somewhere underneath that, somewhere in the part of me that runs parallel to function without interrupting it, something shifted. The anger came. I recognized it the way you recognize a familiar road at night, sweet and known and immediately useful, the kind of thing you reach for when you need something to hold on to. I held on to it. I finished the targeting calculation. I coordinated 2 intercept solutions with Sophie Dan on the Iron Gate. I talked Obi Hartley through a close-range engagement decision that needed to happen in under 15 seconds, and could not afford hesitation. I did not open the secondary frequency log. The battle ended, not with a decisive moment, but with a gradual withdrawal, the Vathi fleet pulling back incrementally, their formation adjusting in ways that the Council's files did not have a precedent for. They had never withdrawn from an active engagement. Their tactical doctrine, as the Council understood it, did not include withdrawal. It included completion. They withdrew. 64 human ships, now 53, held their position and watched a Vathi fleet of 289 vessels, 312 minus 23, pull back to a distance of 400,000 kilometers and stop. The bridge of the Persistence was quiet, not silent. Equipment running, comms channels open, the ongoing work of damage assessment and medical coordination, filling the air with the specific busy sound of aftermath. But underneath all of that, a quiet that had weight. Captain Barlow stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the display. Status on the March and the Kenley, he said. The reports came back. The March was operational. Reduced capacity, significant hull damage, 1 thruster offline, but operational. Commander Claire Adler was running weapons checks. The Kenley's situation was more serious. Structural damage to the forward section. Casualties. But they were there. They were present on the display. And they were responding to communications. And that mattered more right now than anything else. Barlow nodded once. Get me a full damage assessment from every vessel in the formation, he said. And get me a line to Earth Command. He turned and looked at me. Commander Osei, take 15 minutes. He meant it as something kind. An acknowledgement that 4 hours of sustained engagement is not nothing, that people need a moment before the next thing. I went to the secondary comms room. It was empty. I sat down in front of the terminal, and I pulled up the secondary frequency log from the engagement. I found the transmission, 2 calls, my call sign, and then nothing. The origin point was a vessel I did not recognize by designation, a ship from a fleet grouping that had been positioned 47,000 kilometers from our position during the battle. A ship that should, by every record I had access to, have been stationed in an entirely different sector. I sat with that information for exactly 15 minutes. Then I stood up, went back to the bridge, and filed my engagement report. The report was thorough, accurate, complete. In the debrief files transmitted to Earth Command, there was a line in my report that read, "Recommend investigation of secondary frequency activity during engagement for signal intelligence purposes." That was all I said about it. Outside, the Vathi fleet held its position 400,000 kilometers away, running analyses that I could only imagine and making calculations that 600 years of unbroken success had never required them to make. I thought about what they were calculating. Then I thought about Claire Adler, maintaining her position and her fire solutions with a partially damaged ship because she looked at the situation and decided it mattered. I thought about the 37 workers in the belt. I thought about that voice on the secondary frequency. The Vathi were very good at math. The problem was that some of the most important variables in this particular equation were not the kind of things that fit cleanly into a model. We had been fighting things forever, ourselves, the cold, the distance, the dark. The list was long and not particularly heroic sounding and entirely real. The Vathi had assessed us and found a biosphere of extractable value. What they had not found, because they did not have a category for it, was everything else. 8 months after the first engagement, I sat in a briefing room on the Persistence with a cold coffee and a stack of intercepted Vathi communication fragments that Vel had spent 3 weeks translating. Vel's emotional pressure was present even through the text transcripts, which was something I had noticed was happening more often, the way a person's voice changes when they are carrying something heavy, without saying so. The war had a shape now, not a clean shape. Not the kind of shape you can draw on a tactical display and point to and say, "This is what is happening." More like the shape of a thing that is ongoing and unpredictable and nowhere close to over, but is also, undeniably, something different than what the Vathi expected. They had dispatched a second fleet, then a third. The Council's analysts, who had been running silent projections since the first engagement, sent a report 6 months in that I read twice, because the first time I thought I had misunderstood it. The report said, "The Vathi High Conclave has convened. For the first time in recorded history, they are discussing a revision to operational parameters." That sentence sat in my head for a while. In 600 years, the Vathi had never revised their operational parameters. Their parameters had never required revision. The process was clear and the process worked, and revision was, for a species that functions on the certainty of outcome, not a concept that had ever needed to exist. We had introduced them to it. I did not feel triumphant about this. Triumph felt like the wrong word for something that had cost us what this had cost us. More than 100 vessels across 7 months. Thousands of people who had been alive at the beginning of this, and were not alive now. Claire Adler's ship, the March, had been lost in the 5th engagement. Claire had not been on it by then. She had been transferred to Fleet Command. But the March was gone, and everyone who had been on it during the 3rd engagement, when it held its position with 1 thruster offline, was part of the count. I thought about the March's crew often. Vel's translated fragments told a story that was strange and, in its strangeness, deeply revealing. The Vathi had a concept. The Council had never named it directly in any previous briefing, because it had never come up as operationally relevant. Vel named it now. Vel called it the mercy of completion. The Vathi were not, in their own understanding of themselves, destroyers. They were finishers. The 17 civilizations they had erased had not, from the Vathi perspective, been murdered. They had been ended. The distinction was not semantic. To the Vathi, a civilization on a collision course with the Vathi's operational requirements was a civilization that was going to experience a terminal outcome regardless. The Vathi's act of ending them cleanly, efficiently, without prolonged resistance and its associated suffering, was the kinder version of an inevitable event. They genuinely believed that. I sat with that belief for a while. Not because I agreed with it. I did not agree with it. But because understanding it changed the shape of what we were dealing with. We were not fighting villains. Villains know they are wrong and continue anyway, which is its own kind of comprehensible. We were fighting something that had developed, across 6 centuries, an entirely coherent moral framework in which what they were doing was correct, in which mercy looked like termination and kindness looked like efficiency. And we were the first thing they had ever encountered that refused to complete. The fragments Vel translated were clinical in language and increasingly strange in content. One of them, from what Vel identified as an internal assessment document, said something that I read 4 times. Vel's translation, subject species demonstrates persistent functional activity despite cumulative force application, exceeding threshold values associated with terminal behavioral disruption in all previously documented cases. Cross-referencing with historical data yields no comparable precedent. Recommend expansion of threat assessment parameters to include possibility of non-standard disruption tolerance. I showed it to Reggie Nwachukwu during one of our planning calls. He read it twice. They're saying we should have stopped, he said. Yes. And we didn't. No. He leaned back. He had a look on his face that I had come to recognize as Reggie processing something he found genuinely interesting, even when it was also genuinely alarming. So now they're having to build a new category. For us. Because we didn't fit the existing one. That's what the translation suggests. He was quiet for a moment. How many categories do they have? The Council's records list 47 distinct behavioral classifications for species that have encountered the Vathi. And none of those fit us. They're working on 48, I said. The pilots called it the maybe gap. I had borrowed the phrase from a report about the second engagement, the one where a pilot from Cebu named Marco Cruz had threaded his ship through a space in the Vathi formation that the tactical computers rated as non-viable. Non-viable meant the probability of successful transit was below 2%, which in any normal operational calculation meant you did not try it. Marco Cruz had looked at it and thought maybe, and had gone. 2 Vathi capital ships had been destroyed by the resulting positioning shift. Marco had come out the other side with damage to his port engine and a grin that, by all accounts, did not leave his face for approximately 6 days. The Vathi had run projections on that maneuver after the fact. Their analysis concluded that it should not have been attempted, that the odds against success were sufficient to classify the attempt itself as a tactical error, and that the successful outcome was a probability outlier that could not be incorporated into predictive models. What they could not model was the moment Marco Cruz looked at those odds and decided to find out. That was the maybe gap, the space between what the numbers said was possible and what a person decided to attempt anyway. The Vathi's entire operational history had been built on the assumption that rational actors, when faced with sufficient evidence of probable outcome, would align their behavior with the probability. They would do what the math suggested they should do. We kept doing things the math said we shouldn't. Not always. Not casually. We were not reckless. We lost ships. We lost people. The cost was real and continuous, and no one pretended otherwise. But somewhere in the human machinery of decision-making, there was a component that the Vathi's models had no slot for, a thing that looked at the odds and said, but what if? 8 months in, the Galactic Council sent a delegation to the engagement corridor. Not to negotiate, they said, but to observe. I suspected that was not entirely true, and I suspected Vel knew I suspected, and I suspected neither of us was going to say so directly. The observation vessel was small, unarmed, holding position at a significant distance from the active zones. Vel was on it. Vel sent me regular updates, which were more frequent than a purely observational mission required, and which contained more personal content than a diplomatic communication should have. On the 241st day of the conflict, Vel sent me a message that was not about the engagement at all. I have been rereading your species' historical records, Vel said. I have access to a substantial archive. I have been reading since the 2nd month. "What have you been reading?" I asked. "Everything," Vel said. "I started with military history because it seemed relevant. Then I moved into general history because I realized I was missing context. Then I moved into what your records categorize as literature because I realized I was missing something else. And?" A pause, long enough that I thought the channel had dropped. "I think I understand now," Vel said, "why you are built the way you are." I waited. Every species we have records of, every species in the Council's archive, evolved in circumstances where the primary threat was the environment, cold, or heat, or predation, or resource scarcity. They became intelligent, and then they used their intelligence to build structures against those threats. Hierarchies, singular leadership, unified command. The logic was clear. You cannot survive a hostile environment if you are fighting each other, so you stop fighting each other, and you fight the environment together. That is the pattern, every time. "And us?" I said, because I already knew where this was going, but I wanted to hear Vel say it. "You did not stop fighting each other," Vel said. "You never stopped. You built your cities and your nations and your art and your music, and you kept fighting each other through all of it. Every century. Every era. It never stopped." "No," I said, "it didn't. And so you never developed the singular structure, the unified hierarchy, the one voice that could speak for all of you, and the one authority that could command compliance, because you never needed to. Because the fighting each other did not, for you, mean the end of survival. You survived it, and in surviving it, you kept all of it, all the different voices and approaches and methods and decisions. I thought about the 37 workers in the asteroid belt, making their own transmission without asking anyone. I thought about Marco Cruz looking at a 2% probability and deciding to find out. I thought about Claire Adler, holding her position on a damaged ship because she personally decided it was the right call. "The Vathi are looking for the authority to surrender to," Vel said. "They cannot find it because it is not structured the way they expect authority to be structured, and the reason your individual units behave the way they do in engagement is not because they are ordered to. It is because they individually decide to." "Yes," I said. "That is what they cannot model," Vel said. "Not the numbers, not the ships, the decisions." The message after that one came 2 weeks later, and it was not from Vel directly. It was a formal council transmission, routed through Vel's station, and it said that the Vathi High Conclave had, for the first time in 600 years, initiated communication with an opposing species during an active conflict, rather than after its conclusion. They wanted to talk. Not to accept surrender, not to offer terms of compliance. To talk. I read that transmission 3 times. Then I went and looked up the secondary frequency log from the first engagement, the one I had flagged for signal intelligence purposes in my report, the one I had not opened fully in 8 months. I opened it now. The voice was exactly what I had thought it was. The call sign was mine. The person speaking it was someone I had believed, for 5 years, was not among the living. The second transmission was not just my call sign. It was 4 words after it. "I am still here." I sat in the communications room with those 4 words for a long time. Then I pulled the vessel designation and cross-referenced it with the current fleet deployment database. The ship was real. The assignment was current. The name on the crew manifest for that posting was one I recognized, the way you recognize the specific color of a scar. I filed a formal request through command channels for a communication link with that vessel. I wrote the request very carefully, professionally, with the precise language of an official inquiry. Then I sat back and I waited, which was, at this point, something I was very good at. Outside, the Vathi High Conclave was preparing to do something they had never done in 600 years. And somewhere in the debris and the distance of an 8-month engagement that had no clean shape and no clear ending, 52 remaining human vessels held their formation in the dark, crewed by people who had each individually decided, for their own individual reasons, to still be here. I am still here. 4 words. They had no idea how much that costs, or what it means, or what people will do to keep it true. They were about to find out. The Vathi emissary arrived by shuttle, alone, which Vel told me was significant in ways that required a lengthy cultural explanation, that I absorbed but will summarize this way. The Vathi do not send individuals into uncertainty. They send individuals into situations where the outcome is already determined. The fact that one of them came here, to this ship, to this corridor, without a predetermined outcome waiting for them, was the most foreign thing they had ever done. I met it in the main conference room of the Persistence. Captain Barlow was there. 3 members of Earth Command were present via communication link. Vel was there in person, which I understood had required a significant override of the Council's standard protocols, and which I appreciated in ways I did not say out loud. The emissary was large. Not threatening in the way large things are sometimes threatening, but large in the way that something very old is large, like it has been accumulating itself for a very long time. It communicated through a device that translated in real time, and the double-tone voice filled the room and settled into the walls. It was called, in the translation Vel provided, a conclave speaker, not a commander, not a negotiator in the human sense, a speaker, a being whose function was to carry the voice of the collective accurately and completely and without personal interpretation. Vel had explained, on the shuttle before the meeting, that this was a role the Vathi considered sacred, inasmuch as the Vathi had a concept that mapped onto that word. The speaker looked at each of us in turn. I had the distinct impression it was filing us, cataloging us, the way you catalog information before you organize it into an understanding. Then it said, "You are the weapons officer." Not to Barlow, to me. "Yes," I said. "The tactical communications from the first engagement show your voice at a higher frequency of appearance than any other individual across the opposing formation. You were the most present voice." "I talk when I need to," I said. "Why do you not lead this delegation?" Captain Barlow handled this better than most people would have. He did not react visibly. I said, "Because I am not the leader of this delegation. Captain Barlow leads this delegation. He defers to you. He listens to his officers," I said. "That is different." The speaker processed that for a moment. I watched the device it wore shift through what I could only interpret as recalibration. "We do not understand this structure," it said. "We have analyzed your engagements. We have mapped your decision chains. They do not resolve to a singular point. Every unit carries decision authority. This is not efficient." "No," I agreed. "It is not. It should produce worse outcomes." "Tactically, often yes," I said. "Overall, evidently not." Another pause. Vel's emotional pressure in the room had shifted. I could feel it even without looking at Vel directly. Something between intensity and relief, as if Vel had been waiting for this conversation to happen for a very long time. "We have made a significant error," the speaker said. The room was very quiet. "In classification," it continued, "we applied the same assessment framework we have applied to all previous encounters. We measured resource value. We measured force differential. We measured probable resistance duration based on historical precedent. The calculation produced the same result it has always produced. And the actual result was different," Barlow said. It was the first thing he had said since the opening of the meeting. "The actual result was different," the speaker confirmed. The speaker reached into something at its side and produced a display that it set on the table between us. Numbers and patterns that I partially recognized from the engagement data, but organized in a way I had not seen before. Their version of what had happened, their data. The numbers were, in some ways, worse than I expected. In 8 months of engagement, we had inflicted a level of attrition that their models rated as catastrophic, not because of the raw count, though the count was significant, because of the cost. The Vathi's previous engagements had been, from their perspective, extremely low cost. A few vessels, a short duration, a clean conclusion. This was none of those things. This had been long and expensive and unresolved, and showed no trajectory toward resolution. And we were still here. "We have reviewed our records of all 17 previous encounters," the speaker said. "We have found a pattern we did not previously identify because previous data did not require us to look for it." "What pattern?" I asked. Each of the 17 species we encountered had reached, at some point in their development, a period of internal unification, a resolution of internal conflict that produced a singular governing structure. The unification event occurred before or during their early spacefaring period in all 17 cases. And what does that mean for how they behaved? I asked, though I knew. A unified species has a singular point of decision. When that point determines that resistance is not survivable, the species complies. It is a clean mechanism. The governing authority calculates. The calculation resolves. The species acts on the resolution. And we never unified, I said. You are partially unified, the speaker said. You have a coordinating structure for this engagement. But below that structure, each unit retains autonomous decision authority. Each individual retains the capacity to make determinations that the governing structure has not made. This produces a behavior pattern that cannot be modeled from the top level, because the top level does not fully determine the behavior. Vel made a sound, very quiet, not a word, just a sound. The mining workers, Barlow said. The 37 individuals in the asteroid extraction facility, the speaker confirmed. They transmitted a response to our strike on their location. The transmission was not authorized by any element of your governing structure. It was produced entirely from individual decision. Yes, Barlow said. It was correct, the speaker said. There was something in how it said that word, correct, that I wanted to ask about and did not, because the conversation had a direction, and I did not want to interrupt it. We have a framework, the speaker said, for understanding civilizations, 47 classifications, developed across 600 years of encounter. We have been attempting to classify your species since the first engagement. We cannot. What's the problem? I asked. You do not have a stable terminal threshold, the speaker said. Every classification we use is built around a terminal threshold, the point at which a civilization's calculus shifts from resistance to compliance. The point is always findable. It is always a function of accumulated cost against perceived survivability. When cost exceeds the survivability estimate, the threshold is reached. And ours? The speaker was quiet for a moment. Your survivability estimates appear to be individually held and individually calculated. Each unit, each person, carries their own estimate, and the estimates we have observed are inconsistently high. They are frequently higher than the objective data would rationally support. I thought about Marco Cruz and 2% and what if. I thought about the March holding its position. I thought about Obi Hartley, 28 years old, running a close-range engagement decision in under 15 seconds. You are saying, Vel said, speaking for the first time in the meeting, that you cannot find the threshold because the threshold is not one thing. It is millions of things, individually held, individually determined. Yes, the speaker said. And some of those individual thresholds, Vel continued, are set at values that an outside observer would classify as irrational. Set at values that exceed what the data would predict a rational actor to accept, the speaker said. Yes. That is not irrational, I said. Everyone looked at me. That is a different framework for calculating survival, I said. We have been calculating survival for a long time, not species survival, not always. Individual survival, group survival, small group survival. We have been in situations where the data said we would not make it, and some of us decided to find out if the data was right, and sometimes it wasn't. And those times got passed down, not as instructions, as stories, as something in the way we understand ourselves. The speaker was looking at me with the specific quality of something encountering an idea that does not fit any existing structure. You mean, it said slowly, that your anomalously high survivability estimates are not errors, they are learned. They are inherited, I said, from everyone who did not stop when the math said to stop, from everyone who looked at a terminal situation and decided to disagree with it. The silence in the room was the particular silence of a very large thing shifting its position. We have been told, the speaker said, that this engagement cannot be concluded by conventional means. Our analysts have modeled the projected continuation. The conclusion they produce is not satisfactory. For either of us, Barlow said. For either of us, the speaker confirmed. This is the first time in 600 years that this has been true. It picked up the display from the table. We do not have a process for this situation, it said. We do not have a precedent. We do not have a classification. We are here because a conclave that has not convened in 600 years determined that operating outside precedent was preferable to continuing an engagement whose end cannot be predicted. That sounds like a reasonable conclusion, I said. It is, the speaker said. It is the first conclusion of this type we have ever reached. There was, I thought, something almost extraordinary about that, something that would matter enormously in the history of this encounter, and probably in the history of several other things that would come later. But sitting in that room, listening to the double-tone voice filling the space, I mostly felt tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that means the long part is giving way to something else. The formal proceedings started after that. Documents and terms and the slow, careful work of building a framework where no framework had existed. Earth Command's people on the communication link began the process of involving the people who would actually draft whatever came next. I stayed for the opening. Then Barlow gave me a look, and I understood that the next part of this meeting did not require a weapons officer, and I excused myself. I went to the communications room. I sat down at the terminal. There was a message waiting. Sent 6 hours ago from a vessel called the UES Pemberton, which had been reassigned to a support position during the most recent engagement and was currently 300,000 kilometers from our position. The message was not long. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. I sat very still for a while, long enough that the quiet in the room became a specific thing, present and real. Then I opened a reply channel, and I typed 6 words. I know. I have been here too. I sent it. Then I went to get coffee, which was cold by the time I reached the machine, as it always was, as it had been every single morning of the past 8 months. And I drank it, because I had learned a long time ago that waiting for the temperature to be right was a form of waiting I could not afford. The Vathi emissary, in the conference room down the corridor, was sitting across a table from people who were going to spend the next several weeks determining what 600 years of one-sided history turned into when it met something it could not finish. Vel was in that room too, translating, and I knew without needing to feel the emotional pressure across the distance that Vel was thinking something that had no perfect translation, but that mapped, approximately, onto something like, "It is possible, after all." That night I stood in front of the viewport in my quarters and looked at the stars, not for any particular reason, not thinking about anything tactical or strategic or historical, just looking, the way people look at stars when the looking itself is the point. We are a species that looks at stars and thinks about going. We always have, before we had ships, before we had the math, before we had any rational basis for believing we could cross the distance. We looked up and thought about it. We told stories about it. We argued about how and disagreed about when, and fought each other about why, and then we did it anyway. The Vathi had assessed us. They had found a biosphere of extractable value, and a resistance force of manageable proportion, and a species with no history they recognized, and no classification they could apply. What they had not found, because they did not have a category for it, was the particular quality of a species that has spent its entire existence deciding, over and over, in 1,000 languages and 1,000 contexts, and against 1,000 different versions of the math that says otherwise, to still be here. My coffee was cold. I drank it. Someone, somewhere on a ship 300,000 kilometers away, was reading 6 words I had sent and deciding what to say back. The galaxy had 17 data points. They had forgotten to study the species that treated every endpoint like a question worth answering. I am still here. Watch me.